Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money. I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. To the ordinary soldier, Greece was above all an escape from the freezing cold of the Eastern Front. New recruits counted a posting to the southeast as a blessing. Old campaigners saw it as a respite from certain death. In the 4th SS Polizei Panzer Grenadier Division, which fought in various guises across Europe, the general view was that after France, Greece was the loveliest time for the men of the division. Fritz Bergmayer recalled that, quote, after the hard defensive battles round the Volkhov and the Ladoga Sea in the summer of 1943, the news reached the Panzer Jaeger section of SS Pole Division that most of the section was to be posted to Greece. We felt a warm sense of endless spring and sunshine, end quote. And that's an excerpt from Mark Mazower's Inside Hitler's Greece, one of the many sources I use on this podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Diogenes Lamp podcast, the Greek Civil War segment, episode 36, the first round of the Greek Civil War. I want to start this episode the same way I start every episode, by thanking you guys, lovely listeners. I am very happy to see we have a solid cohort of loyal listeners that are following this series. It's an interesting series. It's an interesting conflict. I know it's confusing. I know that I may say things, and then the next episode, other things occur that change what I said earlier. It is confusing. It is not an easy conflict to follow. There's a reason why it is niche. There's a reason why it's underreported, why it's not talked about a lot, at least not in this kind of depth, not even close. So I appreciate you guys following along. I'm actually really impressed. Honestly, this is not easy stuff. So thanks a lot. Another big thank you to my Patreons. Thank you guys. To my Elephantarchos, if I'm saying that correctly, Rongta Wu, Zorchos, Darth Mater, Expat Frank and Darth Mater, Taxiarchos, Megas Yorgos, I believe is a Zorchos, and lastly, my newest Patreon, the None Taken podcast, with the rank of Taxiarchos. Thank you guys so much. Thanks, a big shout out to my new Patreon as well. Please give Dustin's podcast a listen, especially these days if you're at all into current events, like you're a current event junkie, kind of like myself. Fortunately, and unfortunately. Give them a listen. They are maybe like a 25-30% will make you laugh, and then the rest of the time they cover current events like welded into that at the same time, so you're simultaneously laughing and then disgusted with the current state of affairs. But really good commentary, really good drill down and that kind of stuff, and current events and everything else, especially for the average Joe. It's good stuff, and they're a great crew of guys on that podcast as well. Good people around, which is why I have Dustin on here occasionally, if you've listened to past episodes, and we've had a really good time, and we'll have him back on here again sometime soon. Something else, if you are a Patreon and you haven't received a book from me yet, and there are one of you here, please check your messages on Patreon, on the Patreon app or whatever. Check your messages. Get in touch with me. If you are a Patreon supporting member, once a year, usually for either Pascha, for Easter, or Christmas, I send a little book. Nothing major. Stuff like some Greek literature, maybe something from Kazantzakis, maybe some history stuff like Taken at the Flood by, I think, Waterfield or whatever. That's a great book, actually. I just finished, what did I just finish? It's called Greek Fire, Scorpion Bombs, and Poison Arrows. That was a great book. Just finished that guy. I don't know. I get a lot of books that I'll send to you if you are a Patreon once a year. Republic of Fear about Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Terrifying. And Overthrow by Stephen Kissinger, which is like 100 years of like regime changes, mostly in South America he covers, but he covers the Middle East and stuff. Another great book. You get the point. Become a Patreon. I'll get you a book as a token of appreciation. That's really it. And also, like, if you have any like comments or suggestions or whatever, shoot me a message on Instagram, YouTube. I will listen to you guys and take your comments into consideration, unless they're like totally off the wall, batshit comments. Then I will act like I will take them into consideration. I probably won't, but all my listeners, especially my Patreons, are really level-headed, solid people. I've talked to all you guys, and I'm really appreciate your support, and really appreciate that I have them getting this class of people to support me financially, people that are interested in history, that aren't afraid to hear things that they haven't heard before, and get out of their comfort zone and really evaluate things and that kind of and whatnot. So appreciate it a lot. And I do want to apologize as well. I suck with getting things on YouTube on Thursdays. I'm sorry. I'll have the episodes every like Thursday, unless something big happens. I'll have an episode ready for us going forward. I should be able to. If something, if I'm really lazy, maybe Friday morning. But sometimes, like, it may be a couple days before I get YouTube up on the same page as my Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and everything else. So I appreciate your guys' patience a lot. Let's get into it. Where we left off last, our beloved spaghetti eaters, the macaronades, the Italians, had ceased to exist as an occupying force in Greece, and as a result, a significant number of light and heavy weaponry and materiel was acquired by ELAS, and thus, as a paramilitary force, ELAS with its political wing EAM was the dominant Antarctical force in what was now German-occupied Greece. And so, we continue our story and carry on to the end of 1943. As we'll see, there's going to be a lot of changes to the atmosphere. You might be thinking, duh, no shit, the Italians are gone. And sure, that is correct. Of course, there will be major changes. But we're going to see more and more of a convergence of forces that have been building for some time now. One of those we already mentioned, ELAS, the left wing, let's call it. KKE dominated paramilitary with its political wing, EAM. EAM stands for, I'm not going to talk about what it stands for in Greek, but it translates to roughly the National Resistance Front. Another force, though, was the British. Obviously a big player in all of this. We hadn't talked about them too much last episode, but in episode 34 we had. And we had talked specifically about the Cairo Conference that took place in the summer of 1943. And it was a train wreck. What we didn't mention, though, was some of the fallout from it and what it really meant aside from that. Clearly, the Antarctica in Greece and the Greek government and the British had differing priorities. One of the biggest consequences of the Cairo conference and the fiasco that it was that Eddie Myers, was replaced by C.M. Woodhouse, who was Myers's second in command. Why? After all, Myers has been a big part of our story, along with Woodhouse as well, of course, since all the way when they were parachuted into Greece in September of 1942 with their goal of blowing up that damn bridge, right? The Gerolymatos Bridge, Operation Harley. So why did Eddie get canned? Why did Eddie Myers get canned? Well, mostly due to the fiasco at the Cairo conference. It really was that bad in that sense, mostly because of what the Foreign Office interpreted as in a nutshell. And what they interpreted as was that Myers was too pro-ELAS, and that he hadn't done a sufficient job at managing the forces on the ground. And he got a bit of the going native charge, if you've heard that before, going native. We talked briefly about this in episode 30, where he and the SOE had already bumped heads with the Foreign Office once before. That episode, we also touched on the difference between how Myers and how Woodhouse viewed ELAS and EDES. So yeah, this isn't the first time we've ran into this. So why did it matter now? Sure, yeah, Cairo had blown this rift open, but think of the timing. The Allies are in Sicily, about to do an invasion of mainland Italy. Mussolini has been ousted. The Germans are retreating from Russia with the threat of them being cut off completely in the north. In sum, the focus had now shifted from blowing up bridges and setting Europe ablaze to preparing for what would come after. All wars end, eventually, and the British had plans for what would come the day after the last Nazi left Greece. One last way to put it that might make sense. Earlier we saw for ourselves the paradox that was British foreign policy in Greece. Mandates in Greece, even if they're communists hostile to the crown. Short-term vision of inflicting massive losses on Nazis. But the vision now changed. The long term was now being considered. So there you go. Woodhouse, the Greek speaker classicist, now took over for Myers, something that was not well received by ELAS and EAM. And so that is our stage, let's say, for what has become known as the first round of the Civil War. Does the ordinal qualifier first mean there will be more than one round? Yes, absolutely, of course. That's why we have still about another 15 episodes to go. There's actually going to be 3 rounds. The date when the first round actually started, as in when the Civil War itself actually started, is debated. But amongst historians, early October of 1943 is the generally agreed upon date, with an offensive by ELAS on EDES. And quote, "We must react promptly. By that I mean that we should call an EAM, ELAS, EDES, EQQA conference and ask them to sign a public declaration that they would in no way accept the return of the king and will resist with force, if necessary, any such effort. If they decline to sign such a declaration, ELAS and EKKA, must be attacked and dispersed immediately, even if this means that blood will be spilt." That was a quote by Armies-Spyros, who had already been pushing for an offensive to wipe out ELAS's rivals. But if Armies-Spyros had his influence with the boots on the ground, after all he was a Kapitanios, George Syantos, gave the political go-ahead for the offensive, who, lest we forget, was the General Secretary of the KKE, a position he got after our Haji, the KUTVist and Moscow loyalist Nikos Zachariadis, had been deported to Dhaka. And so, on October 8th, fighting began in Epirus, and quickly expanded to parts of western and central Greece. EDES bands took losses in Zagori, Evrytania, Thessaly, and western Greece, where they were attacked and disarmed, while EDES came out on top in much of Arta, Yanina, and Preveza, where ELAS offensives were repelled. Meanwhile, the Germans, aka the Jerrys, the Nazis, had started full-fledged mopping up operations on October 18th, most notably Operations Panther, followed by Operations Tiger and Puma, just to name a couple. These operations were primarily meant to open up the Yanina-Metsovo road that was held by the Andartes, and the Andartes were, for the most part, crushed, with some reports of Andartes even dropping their weapons and running, while the Germans carried out a scorched earth policy to crush morale and to destroy materiel, food, or whatever that else could be used by the Andartes. As reported by the Germans themselves on October 26th, Operation Panther was a complete success and had captured large amounts of ammunition and arms, and had shattered the Andartico, with ELAS taking the lion's share of the beating. This account, by a British liaison officer who was embedded with ELAS, really gives an idea of how successful the mopping up Operation Panther was. And this is, by the way, from Dr. Spyros Tsoutsoumpis' book, The People's Armies. And, quote, "The following morning, we were turned out before daylight and bundled off with a stream of refugees. The next 3 days was just one headlong flight before the Germans, walking about 11 hours a day most of the time. We were a rear guard to the ELAS Andartes. On this troop, several people dropped out and died by the side of the track through exhaustion." End quote. But the Andartes made an organized and professional retreat through the mountain villages. I'm just kidding with you. They did not at all make an organized and professional retreat through the mountain villages. In the words of an EDES guerrilla, quote, "The destruction they have perpetrated," and he's referring to the retreating guerrillas when he says they, "is often far worse than what the Germans did. Houses were completely looted and many people have been left without clothes on their backs. Protests, curses, threats are all that we hear every single day," end quote. Areas like Karditsa and Trikala saw 23,000 people become homeless as a result, and in Epirus, some 40% of the rural population had been rendered homeless. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that the retreating Andartes caused all this damage. The Germans themselves recorded killing hundreds of what they called enemies, which meant little to no distinction between civilians or bandits. And it was recorded by surviving civilians as well that German forces routinely killed or burned anyone or anything in their path that was even remotely considered friendly or associated with the bandits, which was what the Nazis referred to Andartes as. And quote, "Following the losses sustained by the bandits in men, weapons, and material, and also the burning down of all the villages in the region of the pacified area from which shooting was observed, the bands have suffered severe damage." As we're going to see moving forward, ELAS will start to lose some of its popularity as the preeminent and most legitimate Andartico group, mostly due to the burden that they were placing on the mountain villages. And here's an excerpt, by the way, from Dr. Tsoutsoumpis' book, The People's Armies. Quote, "After a unit of ELAS entered the village of Theodoriana, solidly pro-EDES community, its commander warned the assembled villagers that, quote, if the guerrillas come and ask you for food, do as you are asked. If someone is going to die from hunger, then rest assured that you will die first. We, keep it in mind, will die last." So yeah, that's always a great way to win over hearts and minds, right? As we know, torture isn't anything new in our story, but reports of torture specifically at the hands of ELAS guerrillas also took their toll. Reports like having ears cut off for being accused of spreading false rumors about ELAS. Or there's the incident that occurred in Mavlithari, where ELAS arrested 14 people for belonging to a rival Andarti group. This incident was orchestrated by Aris Velouchiotis, who, as I've said in the past, was brave, but was also known for being a bit sadistic. In this circumstance, the first of the 14 was grabbed and tied to a table, with every limb in different direction, spread eagle, if you will, and naked. At this point, the poor sap started screaming for mercy. But under Aris's orders, and at the hand of the butcher of a person who would do such a thing, the tied-down man, slowly, and inch by inch, had his limbs hacked away with an axe, starting with the foot, slowly working up the leg, leaving enough time in between each hack for the trauma and, the blunt force and everything else that goes with such a thing to really kick in. Aris was also known for having British and liaison officers watch. He liked having them watch by helplessly. But in this instance, the embedded British officer wouldn't take it, and he took out his revolver and blew out the fellow's brains, thus taking him out of his agony. Aris was so irate that the British officer had the audacity to end his show early that Aris had to be physically restrained by other ELAS guerrillas from killing the British officer. So torture isn't anything new to our story, but these are like, in terms of like the brutality, that's just like standard mid-level of the just brutal stuff that we have encountered and that we will encounter as we continue on in our story. Anyways, back to developments in the field. If you were paying attention earlier to what we had covered, it may have seemed a bit suspicious that right while ELAS was going on the offensive against EDES with some success, that the Germans just coincidentally happened to launch massive mopping up operations, with ELAS taking the bulk of the beating. Well, in history and in life, coincidences do happen, but this was not one of them. Yes, if you were suspicious, your suspicions were well founded. Zervas and his EDES had arranged a localized ceasefire through indirect channels with the Germans, specifically General Hubert Lanz, which would allow EDES to push back ELAS units that had infiltrated into Zervas' home region of Epirus. Even so, that same month as Operation Panther took place, in 1943 of October, ELAS was able to fully eliminate a rival right-wing group, the PAO, which operated largely in eastern Macedonia. Aside from ELAS and EDES, what was going on elsewhere with our other paramilitary groups? Well, if you haven't noticed thus far in our story, there are dozens of groups. Some are bigger and more well-known ones like ELAS, EDES, EKKA, which is also called, I just call it EQQA because it's easier to say, or the security battalions. And then there are smaller ones like PAO or Organization X, the EDES, who we will encounter later. Some of these groups are just some local guy who managed to get 50 of his friends and their friends organized into some kind of coherent band. And some are some flavor of in between that and anything else. So yeah. Anyways, one of the groups that I want to touch on is a group that I think is important to touch on because the cause of this group and the cause that they're associated with will come into play later. And that group was called the Slavo-Macedonian National Liberation Front, or SNOF, which sounds like one of those pouches you put in your mouth for like the chewing tobacco or whatever. I think that's actually called SNOS. But this group was called SNOF, S-N-O-F. They came into the field in November of 1943, and they peaked in strength around 2,000 armed men. Surprisingly enough, it was ELAS that allowed, although reluctantly, allow the Slavic Macedonian communists of Yugoslavia to organize the Slavophones in the Greek region of Macedonia under an independent command. Remember, for anyone that doesn't know this stuff, when I say Slavophone, that regards to someone who is Slavic speaking, not ethnically speaking, Slavic speaking. Albanophone, someone who's Albanian speaking. Grecophone, someone who's Greek speaking, yada, 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 right? SNOF was supposed to be under the command of ELAS, which in theory would have made ELAS even more powerful in relation to other paramilitaries. But Gochev would receive his orders from the Macedonian Communist Party inside of Yugoslavia. And Gochev was the leader, by the way, of this group. And as a result, there would be several instances of ELAS and SNOF units clashing with each other. All of this SNOF business may sound a bit weird, as there have always been plans either from the Slavs in Yugoslavia, Serbia included, or the Slavs of Bulgaria, to annex Greek Macedonia. In fact, the leader of SNOF, Gochev, was an outspoken advocate of annexing the Greek region of Macedonia into Yugoslavia. Do keep in mind, as we've covered in previous episodes, specifically the episode on the Greek commies, I think it was episode 24, the Cats, Commies, and Castor Oil one. The KKE, the Communist Party of Greece, did have a policy platform of an independent Macedonian state. It was unbelievably unpopular, obviously, and it was axed after a while. The reason I brought this up is because I didn't want us to forget that there was an ethnic minority dimension, and not just there, but throughout Greece. that also bled into certain paramilitary organizations and that kind of thing. Snuff is a prime example of that. As for another one of our big paramilitaries, the security battalions, at this point in our story, they were a sizable counterweight to ELAS, with around 8,000 or 9,000 armed men, mostly in Peloponneso, but also in other parts of Greece. Their reputation wasn't doing much better than the other paramilitary groups. We had mentioned in previous episodes about their conduct, with instances of them carrying out mass looting operations that differed very little in comparison to those carried out by the Nazis, and how many Venizelos and Republicans joined the SBs to fight the new, bigger perceived threat, the Communists. And we talked about how many people joined the SBs for the same reasons other people joined any of the other paramilitary groups, from ELAS to EDES to SNUF to EKUKUA, because you got a gun and you got power. You were a manly man, if you will, right? Or maybe you want to take revenge on someone who killed a brother or a friend of yours. The reasons varied from person to person. Anyways, what I'm getting at is that the SBs weren't much better than other groups, and as we get into the first round of the Civil War, we're going to see the SBs play more and more of a pivotal role, especially in regards to them being a hated enemy of ELAS. After all, the SBs were created practically with the sole purpose to be anti-communist, right? And as we'll see, they would carry out their duties of anti-communism duties, let's say, with fanatical zeal. For example, in November of 1943 in Athens, they went to a hospital, yes, a hospital, and dragged out patients from their beds and took them to prison, which is a pretty harsh thing to do and is eerily reminiscent of how the Nazis kicked out all wounded soldiers from the hospitals in Athens once they arrived. The SBs would continue to do all type of terrible stuff. Like in March of 1944, they would take part in German reprisals, as in they would help those Germans carry out those reprisals. And that month, they shot 100 hostages after a German general was killed. This is the collaborationist stain that the SBs carried around with them. And of course, this is a charge ELAS would be sure to use for their propaganda purposes whenever possible. And on that note, that's it for today. Join us next time as we zoom in on the SOE and their scramble to stop the Antarctico from consuming itself, and hopefully refocus their energies on the Nazi occupiers. Take care.